this is Tessa. This week, I wanted to practice some different blending techniques, and I liked the idea of doing this on pumpkins instead of my usual boring rectangles. There are so many different ways to shade and blend in watercolor, but I'm narrowing it down to 5 for this practice. I draw out 5 ovals on my paper to map out my pumpkins. Then I start to draw in the different segments of each pumpkin. I draw a full oval in the middle of each circle. Some of these ovals I have covering the whole pumpkin top to bottom, and a couple have this largest oval a little shorter, so it looks like you're looking down more at the pumpkin. Once these center ovals are placed, I draw the side segments, each getting more narrow. I draw very simple curved rectangles for the stems. Then I lightly erase some of my initial guidelines before painting. The first layer is a simple flat wash using the bead technique. I mix up some watery orange paint with my red, yellow, and some raw umber to give it that more muted fall tone. Because I'm left-handed, I start at the bottom right of my page and work left. While the orange paint is still wet, I paint in the stems and let the green blend into the pumpkin color. I got this green color by mixing in some raw umber with Hooker's green. I use my brush to soak up any puddles that form at the end of my wash. Before I start my next shape, I make sure I have a large enough mix of paint and mix more as needed. I'm intentionally trying to add more of each color in turn so that each pumpkin is a little different. To shade these pumpkins, I'm going to work segment by segment. This lets me practice on multiple shapes, all of varying sizes. For this first pumpkin, I start by wetting the whole segment with clean water. Then I drop my darker color in the bottom of the shape. The paint spreads everywhere there is water, but is most pigmented where I laid my brush down. I decided that I wanted a little more vibrancy, so you can see me adding a little diluted yellow to the top of this shape. I use my brush to coax the yellow and brown to mix, but I'm careful not to fuss too much. I'm also mindful of the amount of water in my brush. If it's too wet, it will introduce too much water to the wash and give me harsher outlines or backgrounds. If the brush is too dry, it will soak up some of the pigment and leave light patches. Instead of moving on to the next segment, I skip one. This way I don't risk the colors from my previous segment bleeding in with my new one. Once there are no more segments that aren't touching a wet area, I'll let my paper dry. This technique is really good for getting light and subtle color changes and value shifts. Some of the drawbacks are that it shows a bigger drying shift, meaning it gets lighter and duller as it dries. It also depends on wetting an entire shape to avoid hard edges, which can leave you pre-wetting a large area of your paper. This second technique is very similar to the first, but instead of applying clean water to my whole segment, I just apply it to the area I don't want to be dark. Then I pick up my pigment and paint it against the wet area to let them blend. This technique felt the easiest to control and still get a soft blend. It gave me a darker result than the first one, with a little more definition between my light and shadow sides. Since we're still dealing with a lot of water, I'm still careful to bring my wet wash all the way over the shape to avoid unwanted sharp lines. On the third pumpkin, I went straight in with my dark paint. I painted in the shadow shape, then washed my brush and painted the remainder of the shape with clean water. I paint most of my water area before meeting it with the paint, so that I don't introduce too much water that can run into the paint. I really like this technique and I use it often. It works well to get a defined shadow shape with a quicker transition between light and shadow. There's also a much smaller drying shift than in the last two pumpkins. This technique still requires you to wet the shape from edge to edge, and it's a little harder to avoid backruns because you're introducing water to pigment that has had a chance to dry. On my fourth pumpkin, I paint my dark shape onto dry paper. Then, with a dry brush, I work over the edge to blend it out onto the dry paper. I don't think the brush I used for this technique was the right one, as it started to lift my shadow shape. It did work well as a way to feather the color out, and I got the results I was looking for in the bottom left portion of this middle segment. It's a good reminder that I need to experiment with my different brushes and find what sort of marks they're best at. This technique works best for me in small areas with very watery paint. Larger areas and darker paint can lead to fussing and overworking. For my last pumpkin, I use a broken edge technique. This means I'm adjusting the quality of my line and brush strokes right at the edge between light and shadow. Instead of using water and brush to blend, the actual shape of my shadow starts to break up and allow more light shapes to intermingle with it. Similar to the last two pumpkins, I paint my shadow shape onto dry paper. Once I have the general shape, I dab the excess paint off my brush. Then, I start at the edge of my painted shape and slowly dab the brush between my light and shadow. This stippling effect allows some of the light areas to blend with the dark areas and creates a transition between the two. On the stems, I show that sometimes you don't need to blend at all. By painting just the right sides of my stems, I create the illusion of a lit side and a shadow side. I'm sure there are so many blending techniques that I didn't even touch on here. These are the ones I end up using the most. Please try this on your own. Aside from doing what I did with these pumpkins, there are so many ways to experiment with these techniques. You can practice with different brushes, or start to play with the consistency of your paint. Give this exercise a try. I'm interested to know which one is your favorite. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.